A very fresh good morning to all. Welcome back to another session of your science class with your science teacher. As you already know that we are on chapter number 12, Reproduction in Plants. In our previous video, we have discussed about asexual reproduction in plants, the ways of or the modes of asexual reproduction in plants, and in our today's session, we will discuss about sexual reproduction in plants. So let's begin. Well, students, you must know that in flowering plants, flowers are the main organs of reproduction. The flowers perform the function of reproduction in plants. So, I can say that the reproductive organ in plants are flowers. In today's video, we will discuss about the structure of a flower and how fertilization takes place in flowers. Let's begin with the structure of a flower. For holding any flower, there is a thin, stalk-like structure which is known as pedicel. We hold any flower with its pedicel. After pedicels, there are tiny green colored leaves that encloses the buds or that holds all the petals together. These tiny green color leaves are known as sepals. S-E-P-A-L-S, sepals. After sepals, in any flower, there are brightly beautiful colored leaves, maybe yellow in color, maybe red in color, maybe pink in color, or maybe orange in color. These beautiful colored leaves are known as petals. Pedicel, sepal and petals, they are known reproductive parts of the flower. They have nothing to do in the process of reproduction. Now, let's talk about reproductive parts of a flower. In the center of a flower, there is a structure like this. The central structure of the flower is the female part of the flower. This female part of the flower is known as carpel, C-A-R-P-E-L, carpel, or pistil, P-I-S-T-I-L, pistil. Repeating, the female part of any flower is called carpel or pistil. This female part, it consists of three subparts. This uppermost part is known as stigma, S-T-I-G-M-A, stigma. This tube-like structure in the middle, this is known as style, S-T-Y-L-E, style. And this swollen part at the bottom, this is known as ovary. O-V-A-R-Y, ovary. Again repeating, carpel or pistil is the female reproductive part of a flower and it consists of three subparts. This upper part is known as stigma. This tube-like structure in the middle, this is known as style, and this swollen structure at the bottom, it is known as ovary. O-V-A-R-Y, ovary. Now, let's talk about male part of the flower. Male part of the flower, you can see these structures, right? These structures are the male part of a flower. They are named as stamen. S-T-A-M-E-N, stamen. Stamen is the male part of any flower. Stamen further, it consists of two parts. The thread-like structure, this filament, the thread-like structure is known as filament, F-I-L-A-M-E-N-T, filament, and this part at the top, this is known as anther, A-N-T-H-E-R, anther. Again repeating, stamen is the male part of a flower and it consists of two subparts. The thread-like structure is known as filament, F-I-L-A-M-E-N-T, filament, and this top part is known as anther. A-N-T-H-E-R, anther. Now, let's learn the fertilization in flowers. So students, first you should know the meaning of this word fertilization. What is fertilization? If this is a female gamete or the female sex cell and this is the male gamete or the male sex cell, when the two sex cells, male and the female one, they fuse, the meaning of fuse or the fusion is to unite. When the two cells or the two gametes, male gamete and the female gamete, they fuse, this fusion process of the two gametes, it is known as fertilization. When the two gametes, male gamete and the female gamete, they fuse, it forms a single cell, and the single cell so formed is known as zygote. Z-Y-G-O-T-E, zygote. So in very simple words, fertilization is the process of fusion of male and female gametes. On fertilization, the single cell so formed is known as zygote. Now let us learn where are male and the female gametes found in flower. This is the male part of a flower, right? Stamen, as already told. It has anther. In this anther, there are very tiny cells, very tiny cells. These cells are known as pollen grains. P-O-L-L-E-N, pollen, G-R-A-I-N-S, pollen grains. Pollen grains, they produce male gametes. Okay, this is how male gametes are formed in a flower. Now, this is the female part of the flower, right, which is known as carpel or pistil. The swollen part at the bottom is known as ovary. Inside the ovaries, there are cells. These cells are known as ovules. O-V-U-L-E-S, ovules. And the ovule contains the egg cells or the female gametes. For the fertilization to take place in flowers, pollen grains from the anther needs to be transferred to the stigma. And this process of transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma is known as pollination. Repeating, transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma is known as pollination. Pollination can be done with the help of an insect, butterfly, wind, water, or some other pollinating agents. This transfer of pollen grains, these structures from anther to the stigma, is known as pollination. After the pollen grain, as you can see, after the pollen grain lands on the stigma, the pollen grain, it forms a tube. This tube is known as pollen tube. The pollen tube, it carries a male gamete. This pollen tube grows through the style and reaches to the ovary and finally reaches to the ovule. Inside the ovule, this is ovule as you can see, inside the ovule, the male and the female gamete, they fuse to form an egg cell known as zygote. Zygote further develops into an embryo inside the seed. Now, what will happen after fertilization? After fertilization, this ovary part, it will turn into a fruit. And the ovules, these ovules will turn into seeds. and the remaining parts, the remaining non-reproductive parts like stamens, sepals, petals, they all fall off. This ovule, it will enlarge, dry up and develop into a seed which will contain a baby plant. As already discussed, the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower is called pollination. Pollination can be of two types, self-pollination and cross-pollination. Let us understand the difference between two. Imagine this is a tree and it bears a flower. It has two flowers. If the pollen grain, it transfers from the anther to the stigma of a same flower or from anther to the stigma of another flower but on the same plant, this is known as self-pollination. Means the pollination taking place on the same plant, that is known as self-pollination. Pollination between the same flowers or the pollination between two flowers but on the same plant, that is known as self-pollination. Now cross-pollination. These are two different plants bearing flowers. If the pollen grain transfer from anther to the stigma, from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower on the another plant but of the same species. Again repeating, if the pollen grain transfers from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower on another plant but of the same species, that is known as cross-pollination. And that's all for today. Do like and subscribe the channel for further notifications.